Hi there, this is Kevin Patton with a brief audio introduction to episode number 38 of the A&P Professor podcast, also known as TAPP Radio, an audio circus and thrill show for teachers of human anatomy and physiology. Well, episode 38 is going to be a little bit longer than average, and that's because we're going to be covering a number of different topics. One is sperm speed and what that has to do with the success of sperm. And we're going to talk about hematopoiesis again, this time hematopoiesis in the gut. And we answer the question that's been burning in the back of your mind for a long time. How long does it take for a Lego piece to pass through the GI tract? And we have a new sponsor. You'll learn all about that in the next episode. And the featured topic is mid-semester check-ins. They help keep your A&P course on track. One of the many fun things about doing this podcast is all of that conversation and correspondence that I have with listeners related to things that come up in the various episodes. And I recently got a message from Charlie Taylor, who was responding to this ongoing conversation we've had about giving students feedback about their performance on a test and how to use that is a way to, correct misunderstandings and misconceptions so that the students can have a sound grounding and be able to move on in the course. And Charlie sent a message that points out that he found that the best way is to do a brief post-mortem to the whole class, reviewing the questions that were most commonly answered wrong with a discussion in class. And I think that's a great way to handle that. Now, of course, it depends on how you have your tests and exams set up, so that if it were an in-class test or an online test that had a specific start and end date, I think this is a great way to come in after that's over and say, look, a lot of you got this one wrong. Or if, like me, you're using kind of a mix of different test items, there are similarities. So you could say something like, well, here's an example of this type of question that students got wrong, and let's work through that. And it might be tricky enough that you might want to take another example from, a different version of the test of the same type of question and say, okay, here's another example of that kind of question. Let's go through this one. You see how that works, and hopefully they're better at it. So I think that idea of doing a group postmortem is a good one because then you get a lot of interaction. And I think the key word there is discussion. By discussing back and forth, I think it's easier for the students to see what went wrong and why, rather than just, handing out a list of correct answers and leaving it at that. So thanks, Charlie, for that feedback. Anybody else has some feedback or additional tips or advice, I sure would love to hear them. Well, once again, I have some word dissections. And once again, these are terms that are related to topics that we're going to be covering in the full episode that comes a few days after this preview episode. And the first term is chimerism. And that ism ending tells us right away that it's a condition or state of being. And so a state of being what? Well, of being a chimera. So what's a chimera? Well, literally, a chimera is a young female goat. But in mythology, for example, in Homer's Iliad, it's a term that's used to represent a fire-breathing monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. The point here being that it's a mashup, a mix-up of different kinds of organisms, each with presumably a different genetic code. And in human biology, then, chimerism refers to a condition where we have two or more genetically distinct tissues within the same person. An allograft is another term I want to dissect. Allo is a word part that means other. And the root of that term is graft, G-R-A-F-T, which originates from grafting a stem onto a living plant. And when that happens, at least the traditional way of grafting a stem is to slice it into a little point that fits into the groove on the main plant onto which that stem is being grafted. And that term graft came from the word graph, G-R-A-P-H, meaning writing, because a stylus and then later on a pen, they're pointed like the tip of the grafted stem. So graft and graph actually derive from the same original term. But in this case, we're talking about grafting tissues. That is, human tissues that are being taken from one person and put into another. So in human biology, the term allograft refers to putting tissue from one person into the body of another person. That is, at least for a while, having two genetically distinct tissues there. Another term that I want to dissect is progenitor cell. Now, originally, the word progenitor meant founder of a family. But let's break it down a little bit. Pro is a prefix that means first, or having some kind of priority in time. And genitor means parent, but we can break that down further too. Gen means to create, in this case, in the sense of begetting. And the tor in genitor, the tor means personal agent. And we see that in other ordinary terms like janitor or orator. That means they're an agent that orates, for example, in the case of orator. So progenitor means a parent, basically, a person who is the beginning of a series of parental generations. And then that word cell in progenitor cell, we've run into that before, and you all know that that literally means storeroom or closet. And at some point it was also applied to small rooms in monasteries and jails and maybe even some faculty offices. But, when we first started seeing cells under the microscope, it kind of looked like a whole bunch of little rooms, and so they got the name cell. So it just is a kind of cell, a progenitor cell. So in human biology, a progenitor cell is like a stem cell, but it's a little bit more specific. It's not quite as generic as a stem cell. Progenitor cell is primed to differentiate into a particular type or subset of cell types. This preview episode is sponsored by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. In a few months, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society annual conference is going to be held in Portland. And last year, right before the annual HAPS conference, I put out a special bonus episode called Kevin's Unofficial Guide to the HAPS Conference. And that proved to be a pretty popular episode. People told me they got a lot out of it. So I'm planning another one in anticipation for the next HAPS conference. And what I need from you is some help. If you could call in with any questions you have about the HAPS conference that need to be answered, I'll find the answers for you if I don't already have them. Or you might want to call in with something you learned about, some good ways to make the best or make the most out of your HAPS conference, or maybe just some general feedback on what it was like to be there at a HAPS conference. I'm sure that people who have never been before would like to hear that. So please, please, please call in with anything you have related to the HAPS conference at 1-833-LION-DEN. That's 1-833-546-6336. Or send me a message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. But I'd really, really, really love to have some voice feedback. So you can record that if you want and email it to me, or just call into the podcast hotline. I really appreciate your help with this. Thanks. Well, it's time for another recommendation from the A&P Professor Book Club. And this time it's a book by James Lang called Small Teaching, Everyday Lessons from the Science of Learning. And Small Teaching was the first book I listed in the A&P Professor Book Club all those many months ago, having mentioned it already in several of the early episodes episode 3, episode 5, episode 17. There are probably a couple other episodes I mentioned it in. And so before I started doing these previews, I already had it in the book club, but I've never really mentioned it in one of these previews before. And it's such an awesome book. I wanted to make sure that I did mention it in these regular book club segments that I do only in the preview episodes. So what's this book about? Well, it's a small book. It's not only small teaching, it's a small book. And it's really a really easy read. And, research into how we learn has opened the door for using cognitive theory, that is what I usually call learning science, to facilitate better student learning. But that's easier said than done, right? A lot of books about cognitive theory introduce radical but impractical theories, failing to make that connection to the classroom. In Small Teaching, though, James Lang presents a strategy for improving student learning with a series of modest but powerful changes that make a big difference, many of which can be put into practice in a single class period. These strategies are designed to bridge the chasm between primary research and the classroom environment in a way that can be implemented by any faculty in any discipline, yes, even in A&P.